What are the mathematical odds of surviving the epicenter of a nuclear explosion? For any human being, the probability is effectively zero. But to experience the unimaginable fury of an atomic bomb, and then, just 3 days later, to look up and see a second atomic sun ignite the sky, defies all logic. Yet for one man, this impossible nightmare was reality. Our story begins not in ashes, but in the sweltering heat of early August, 1945. Hiroshima was a vital military and industrial hub for the Japanese Empire, yet it remained strangely untouched by the devastating firebombings that had already ravaged other major cities. Inside the sprawling shipyard, 29-year-old naval engineer Tsutomu Yamaguchi was exhausted. For 3 long months, he had been stationed here on an extended business trip, far away from home. His mind, however, was anchored hundreds of miles to the southwest. He longed to return to his young wife, Hisako, and their baby boy. Finally, his grueling deployment had come to an end. It was the evening of August 5th, the night before their scheduled departure. The 3 colleagues spent the evening packing their meager belongings. Tsutomu carefully tucked away small gifts he had managed to secure for his family. Outside, the city of Hiroshima slept under a clear, starlit sky, completely unaware of what the dawn would bring. Morning broke on August 6th with brilliant clarity. The weather was famously beautiful that day. Tsutomu and his colleagues left their boarding house early, eager to catch the morning train back home. But as they approached the bustling tram station, a seemingly insignificant oversight changed the course of Tsutomu's entire life. While checking his documents, he realized he had made a crucial mistake. He had forgotten his hanko, a personal carved ink seal that was absolutely required to finalize his travel documents at the shipyard before leaving the city. Without that small wooden stamp, he could not officially leave his post. Handing his heavy luggage to his colleagues, he urged them to wait for him at the station while he hurried back to retrieve it. He retraced his steps through the waking city. The summer sun was already beating down, warming the pavement as workers and students flowed past him, beginning their daily routines. Retrieving the hanko took only a few minutes. Slipping the wooden seal into his trouser pocket, he immediately headed back out into the sweltering heat. But rather than going straight back to the train station, protocol dictated he had to return to the Mitsubishi shipyard first to receive the final exit stamp from his superiors. It was exactly 8:15 in the morning. Tsutomu was walking past a large open potato patch near the edge of the shipyard docks. The area was quiet, isolated from the morning rush of the city center. Suddenly, the rhythmic, heavy drone of an aircraft engine broke the silence. It was a sound every Japanese citizen recognized instantly, though rarely did a lone plane trigger the city's air raid sirens. Squinting against the brilliant sun, Tsutomu spotted it. A single American B-29 bomber soaring at an immense altitude. Its silver fuselage gleamed beautifully, almost peacefully, against the perfect blue backdrop. As he watched, mesmerized by the solitary silver plane, he saw something fall from its belly. 2 small white parachutes bloomed into the sky, drifting lazily downward. He stared at the falling objects, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. And then, in a fraction of a microsecond, the world simply ceased to exist. It was replaced by a flash of light so intense, it defied human comprehension. Before the sound of the detonation could even travel, a silent wave of thermal radiation struck with the force of a sun moving to the Earth's surface. In that blinding fraction of a second, muscle memory from countless air raid drills took over. He threw his hands to his face, plugging his ears and covering his eyes, and dove for the dirt. He barely reached the ground before the blast wave arrived, a supersonic wall of crushing, superheated pressure. The sheer kinetic force plucked him from the shallow ditch, hurling him mercilessly into the violent, churning air. He slammed back into the earth, his body battered, as the brilliant morning sun was instantly swallowed by an impenetrable, suffocating darkness. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. Only the heavy, choking taste of pulverized earth and the silence of a destroyed world. When consciousness slowly crept back into his mind, the silence in his head was absolute. The immense concussive force had violently ruptured his left eardrum. Deafened and disoriented, he stared at his left arm, realizing the intense heat had cooked his skin in a fraction of a second. Staggering to his feet, the young engineer looked out upon an impossible landscape. The thriving, bustling industrial city of Hiroshima had been erased. In its place stood a monstrous boiling pillar of purple and grey smoke, towering ominously into the stratosphere. Pain finally pierced through his shock. Gripping his searing left arm, panic set in as he realized the sheer scale of the nightmare he had just awakened into. His immediate overriding thought was survival. He had to find his colleagues, Iwanaga and Sato, if they were even still alive. Stumbling deeper into the ruins, he encountered the first victims of the flash. Ghostly figures wandering blindly through the ash, their skin hanging in long, melted ribbons from their outstretched arms. Forcing himself to look away, he dragged his battered body toward the shipyard's core, praying that the heavily reinforced concrete structures had somehow withstood the blast. Beneath the twisted steel, he found the entrance to a subterranean air raid shelter. Inside, the darkness was thick with the agonizing moans of dying workers. Collapsing against the damp concrete wall, his strength finally gave out. A fellow survivor wordlessly offered him a tin cup of dirty water, which he drank with desperate gratitude. He spent the night shivering in shock, wrapping his weeping burns with the torn remnants of his shirt, while a relentless firestorm consumed the remains of the city above them. When a pale, ash-choked dawn broke on August 7th, the roaring fires outside had finally died down enough to allow movement. Driven by a primal, desperate need to return to his wife and infant son, Tsutomu made a seemingly impossible decision. He would walk across the pulverized city to reach the train station. The journey across the epicenter was a descent into a waking hell. Every familiar landmark had been violently erased, replaced by endless mounds of scorched earth and the dead. His path was soon blocked by a wide, sluggish river. The main bridge had collapsed, and the water was thick with the bodies of those who had vainly sought refuge from the flames. With no other way across, he found a twisted iron railway beam spanning the wreckage. Balancing precariously over the horrifying scene below, he crawled across on his hands and knees, refusing to look down. Miraculously, as he reached the western outskirts of the ruined city, he found a pocket of organized chaos. A functioning train line was still operating. And there, amidst a sea of displaced and suffering refugees, he spotted two impossibly familiar faces. His colleagues, Iwanaga and Sato. They had survived the initial blast by sheltering in a heavily reinforced stairwell. Assuming Tsutomu was dead, they had faithfully guarded his leather suitcase. At the sight of them, the hardened engineer finally broke down in tears. When a relief train designated for the wounded finally arrived, the three battered men forced their way through the desperate crowds and squeezed aboard. Inside the stifling, dark train carriage, the overcrowded train clattered slowly out of the irradiated wasteland, beginning a grueling, agonizingly slow overnight journey out of the nightmare. For hours they rattled southward, leaving the devastation behind as the landscape slowly transformed back into the lush, untouched green hills of the Japanese countryside. On the morning of August 8th, the train finally hissed to a halt. Tsutomu Yamaguchi had made it home to the safe, bustling, and completely untouched city of Nagasaki. Upon arriving in Nagasaki, he bypassed his own home, heading straight for the nearest local hospital to have his severe, weeping burns properly assessed and cleaned. The medical staff were completely baffled by the nature of his injuries. They slathered his flash burns with thick ointment and swathed his upper body in heavy, restrictive white bandages. Patched up and utterly exhausted, he finally made the slow walk to his own front door, desperate for the sanctuary of his family. Seeing her husband standing in the doorway, wrapped like a mummy and smelling of smoke and iodine, Hisako was overwhelmed with shock, weeping as she gently embraced him. He collapsed into a feverish sleep that night, his mind trapped in an endless, terrifying loop of blinding white flashes and the agonizing cries of the dying. But when the morning of August 9th broke, bringing another beautifully clear, sunny day, Tsutomu's deeply ingrained sense of duty took hold of him once again. Despite a high fever and his wife's desperate pleas for him to stay in bed, the young engineer dressed himself as best as he could, determined to report to his superiors. He walked slowly through the steep, winding streets of Nagasaki. The city was peaceful, wholly unaware of the apocalyptic horror that had consumed Hiroshima just 3 days prior. Arriving at the local Mitsubishi headquarters, he became an instant spectacle. Whispers followed him down the corridor as he made his way to the director's office. He was immediately summoned by the branch director to report on the status of the Hiroshima shipyards and the fate of his colleagues. Tsutomu recounted the impossible nightmare. He explained how a single flash of light had instantly pulverized a massive, sprawling industrial metropolis into dust. But his superior simply refused to believe him. The idea that a single bomb could possess such destructive power was considered utterly preposterous. Frustrated and feverish, Tsutomu pleaded with the director, pointing to his own severe burns as indisputable proof of the weapon's terrifying, unnatural heat. The director stood up, harshly accusing the young engineer of losing his mind to the trauma of a conventional air raid, telling him that what he was describing was mathematically and physically impossible. And exactly at that precise moment, history repeated its darkest hour. High above the clouds, a second silver bomber released its payload. This time, it was a plutonium core, a weapon far more complex and devastatingly powerful than the one that had erased Hiroshima. Inside the office, mid-argument, the hairs on the back of Tsutomu's neck stood up. The quality of the light in the room suddenly shifted. He knew that silence. Before his superior could utter another word, the impossible white light consumed the room for a second time. Driven by the agonizingly fresh memory of Hiroshima, Tsutomu didn't hesitate. He dove violently beneath the heavy wooden desk, bracing himself for the crushing impact. A split second later, the shockwave struck. The thick glass windows imploded into a deadly storm of shrapnel, tearing the office apart and hurling the director violently across the room. The sheer concussive pressure forcefully shoved the massive mahogany desk backward, showering the terrified engineer in a thick, choking cascade of pulverized plaster and wood. Once again, the world violently collapsed into pitch-black darkness, leaving Tsutomu buried under the wreckage of a second destroyed city. As the howling wind died down, a suffocating silence returned. Coughing through the thick dust, Tsutomu dragged himself from beneath the shattered remains of the desk. His pristine bandages were now soaked in fresh blood and black ash. He glanced at his superior, who sat slumped against the ruined wall, bleeding and frozen in utter disbelief. Ignoring his own agonizing pain, the young engineer staggered toward the blown-out window frame, dreading what he was about to see. Below him, the vibrant, untouched valley of Nagasaki was gone. It had been replaced by a raging ocean of fire and flattened, smoking ruins. Above it all, a second, even larger monstrous pillar of boiling purple and black smoke clawed its way into the heavens. The horrific realization washed over him like a physical blow. The nightmare had followed him home, but despair quickly gave way to a singular, terrifying thought. Hisako and his infant son were out there, somewhere in the burning valley. Pushing past his physical limits and the agonizing pain of his wounds, Tsutomu forced himself into the burning, chaotic streets, running headlong into the heart of the destruction to find his family. He arrived at the ruins of his neighborhood to find a landscape of splinters and ash. His home, the sanctuary he had just returned to, was gone. For a moment, the weight of the second apocalypse threatened to break his spirit. He clawed at the debris, fearing the worst for the family he had traveled through hell to reach. Then, a miracle amidst the charcoal. Hisako had seen the flash and, remembering Tsutomu's warnings from the night before, had dragged their son into a reinforced hillside shelter just seconds before the blast. They were alive, but the nightmare was far from over. As they huddled together in the ruins, a toxic black rain began to fall, soaking their skin with the invisible poison of the atomic age. In the days that followed, the invisible killer, radiation sickness, set in. Tsutomu's hair fell out, his wounds refused to heal, and his body began to waste away from the inside. Against every medical odds, Tsutomu Yamaguchi did more than just survive. He endured. He lived to see his children grow, a living testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In 2009, he became the only person officially recognized by the Japanese government as a survivor of both atomic bombings. a double hibakusha. He spent his final years as a fierce advocate for peace, using his scarred body and his improbable story to warn the world of the madness of nuclear weapons. He was a man who saw two suns rise in the same week and lived to tell the world that such a dawn must never happen again. Tsutomu Yamaguchi passed away at the age of 93. A man who survived the impossible, leaving behind a legacy of survival and a warning for all of humanity.